and everything else. You don't want to do that.
At church. So we are live right now. I'm going to go ahead and share it. Hopefully I don't make it. Somebody is
Pinging.
who's pinging?
Who's pinging? Oops.
Hello everyone on social media. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you share this video with someone, let them know that we're on. We're getting ready to get started. This is the show before the show.
Sneak peek. Peek behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, yes. We got the illustrious Cheyenne Webb Crossword. Good evening, and welcome to Hearts and Heels. We're super excited that you've joined us tonight, those on the radio. I'm one of your hosts, Shay Robinson, and as you know, over the past couple weeks, we've been talking about the Black church, and we've been hosting several shows, and tonight we do have a great show to continue this conversation. I hope you got a chance to watch it on PBS. If you have not gotten a chance, you can always go to their website, pbs.org, and it's right there for you, the Black church. Remember, you can always rewatch this show or share it with someone at Hearts and Heels, the #1 on Facebook. But I just want to give you my take really close before I pass it off to the beautiful Yolanda Kelly. But I thought it was a really, really interesting show, and it gave a lot of great information and history stuff I did not know. It was really impactful in a lot of ways. It made me appreciate the Black church in a different way that I have not in a long, long time. Yolanda, what's your thoughts?
My thoughts about the show, I think Henry Gates did a wonderful job bringing several different dynamics, actually the African dance, and then the history of our culture, the history of the church, how the church got started. So one of the things he said that was very interesting to me, that the Black church is the epic center of entrepreneurs, and it is. I feel like that barbershops and attorneys and your seamstress, a lot of our entrepreneurship started right in the Black church. And so tonight we have some wonderful guests in the studio with us tonight. I'm so thankful and delighted to have Mrs. Cheyenne Kreisberg here tonight. She is the author of a book. It's called Selma, Lord Selma. Also, she is a civil rights activist, and so we thank you for being with us on tonight. And also, to my right, we have Pastor Thomas E. Jordan from Lily Baptist Church, and he's been wonderful. He's been on our show before, and so we say thank you for coming again and being our guest. We're going to continue our conversation on tonight about the Black church, and we're going to just go with it. How about that? We're going to talk about some interesting things about what happened with the Black church and also in the civil rights movement, because we are the center, the heart of the civil rights movement here in Montgomery, Alabama, and we have some folks here that know more about that than that I could just say about it. And so, Cheyenne, we thank you for being here. And when we talk about civil rights movement, the Black church was very instrumental in starting the civil rights movement. Can you tell us some things? What do you think about when we say Lord, Selma, Lord, Selma? What is it, Selma, Lord, Selma? What are some thoughts when you wrote that book? What were you dealing with?
You know, when we say Selma, Lord, Selma, the way in which that title came about, we first thought there were many freedom songs that were sung in the church when we used to go to mass meetings. And one of the songs was, and it was one of my favorites, Come By Here, My Lord, Come By Here. So we initially thought about that song when we were thinking about the title of Selma, Lord, Selma. And when you think about Selma, nothing could have happened in Selma during those turbulent times in the 60s without having a fervent faith, Reverend Jordan, and without praying and the church. They were three very important entities that we all had to deal with. Whoever came from anywhere and had that courage to join that movement, you had to have a fervent faith. Prayer was in front of everything, and we had to have fervent faith.
Right.
So, in thinking about that title, you know, I have so many thoughts because it was so much embodied around that.
Right.
And the biggest thing was, you know, we knew that we needed the Lord to come by here.
Yes.
And from that, we decided to name the book Selma, Lord Selma. And even today, the title is depicted on what we're being challenged today, not just in Selma, but all over the world.
All over the world. Tell me about that day, March 1965, crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge. Tell me what that scene was like for a young girl. Can you recall?
Most certainly. That was a vivid moment for me, being the youngest little girl at 8 years old on that bloody Sunday march in Selma. I'll never forget the many threats that had been made about the possibilities of what would happen to anyone who participated in that march. And I had become a very disobedient child. My parents couldn't do anything with me. So I had already made up in my mind, Reverend Joy, that I wasn't going to let nobody turn me around.
I love it.
So I participated on that march, even though I had heard about the threats. And I was determined to participate. And I'll never forget that vivid moment on that Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Yolanda. It was the most traumatic experience of my life as a child. I'll never forget seeing hundreds of policemen with billy clubs, hundreds of state troopers on horses, saw the tear gas mask, the dogs. And I could vividly remember on that day when the late Congressman John Lewis and the late Hosea Williams, who were the leaders of that march, they were asked to turn all of the marchers around. However, they refused. And after they refused, Shay, racism unleashed its brutality upon us. Tear gas had begun to burst in the air. People had begun to be beaten down with billy clubs as if they weren't even human beings. The dogs and the horses had begun to push their way into the crowd, just trampling over people. And you can see people falling, crawling, bleeding, and many of them were crying as I was. And as that tear gas was burning in my eyes on that day, I'll never forget. I, like many others, we were running, trying to make our way back to Brown Chapel AME Church, the now historic Brown Chapel AME Church. And I'll never forget being that little girl running, just like many others, trying to make my way back. They were going to Brown Chapel Church. I wanted to get home. And I was raised in George Washington Carver Projects, which Brown Chapel sat right there in the middle of George Washington Carver Project. And as I was running, I'll never forget the late Hosea Williams picking me up. And my legs were still galloping in his arms. And I remember turning to him, and my eyes were still burning. And I said to him in my own childish voice, "Put me down, because you are not running fast enough." And of course, he would accompany me all the way back to George Washington Carver Projects, Reverend Joy. And I still could see the horses and the dogs that had come all the way from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, still trying to trample people over. And after I had made my way back home that day, there my parents were standing in the doors, if they were, waiting for their child to come home. And my dad had his shotgun in his hand. And when they saw me, they opened up that door, and I ran between them up the stairs to my room, and they would come behind me to try and comfort me. The picture of Bloody Sunday has never left my heart, neither my mind. A vivid moment in history, a vivid moment that brought about great change that I'll never, ever forget. Selma. Lord Selma.
I have a picture here, and I want to see what you thought of this picture. Can you tell me? I know. Can you tell me?
You about to make me cry.
When you held the hands of those soldiers next to you.
Let me tell you something. During the 60s, being that little girl, this little girl right here, you couldn't be a part of that movement without having courage.
That's right.
On every march, you never knew what would happen. On any given day, just being involved in that movement, because it wasn't ordinary for anyone to become involved in that movement. So if you had made up in your mind that you were going to join in that movement, you had to have courage. And you had to have a certain type of faith. You know what I'm talking about, Reverend Jordan. Just to be, it had to be embedded in you. And that came from me, from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because Reverend Jordan, after I met Dr. King, he gravitated my heart and my mind as a little girl. And that's why my mom and dad couldn't do anything. And see, you had to know the man. And in order to know the man, you had to be in his midst. And the things that he taught us, all of us. See, I grew in that movement. It didn't instantly come to me about all the changes that will happen there. All I knew as that little girl is that my parents didn't have the right to vote. And I wanted to be a part of that movement to fight for them because they were afraid. And it just wasn't ordinary. You can lose your jobs.
That's right.
You can lose your lives. They were scared.
Right.
It was 8 of us. They had to take care of us. So I just made up in my mind that I wasn't going to let nobody turn me around.
Selma, Lord Selma.
I was getting in good trouble and didn't even know it.
Yes. And you made history while doing it.
Yeah, so this picture is a little girl who obviously wanted to be a part of change.
Yes.
And that's what I did. I slipped away. I didn't go to school many of days. Because anytime I would see those people out there in front of Browns Chapel Church, I would join.
Be a part of it.
Yes.
I think, that's such a powerful story. I love that you brought up Dr. Martin Luther King, because in the documentary, it talked a lot about how some churches and some people, some black people just didn't get involved in that movement, which was really interesting to me, because when you tell the story, you automatically think all black people, were involved in the movement and all white people hated black people, right? And then they talked about how powerful Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his when he came into the picture, how things changed from the movement. So just as we asked Cheyenne, I have to ask this question to my pastor, Pastor Jordan. When we say Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what comes to mind? What do you feel? What happens to you when you think of that name?
Well, let me say before I try to answer that question, how honored I am to be among 3 beautiful young ladies. And even though I'm more advanced in years than Sister Cheyenne Webb Christberg, I was honored to have the association of knowing and being around the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I think it was just sort of a magnetic feeling to just to be around, just to hear the treble in his voice, his oratorical style, and to just be around his persona. Dr. King was, you would have thought that he was a large person, but I think he was about 5'7". So he was relatively short, but his voice was so thunderous, and his message was so magnanimous that it just grasp your attention and your hold. And we saw him then as a pastor, as a preacher, not of the international figure that he was to become. So just to sit Sunday after Sunday, we heard our pastor preaching, interpreting the gospel of Jesus Christ to his congregation, and we were just enthralled with his youthfulness, and his intellectuality.
And his inspiration.
Right.
Yes.
He inspired a lot of people. One thing that I found really interesting in the documentary, and I know, Pastor, you got a chance to listen to it, but I wanted to share this thought because I didn't know that his I Have a Dream speech actually came from, the title of the speech came from a young lady who was praying, right?
Yeah.
So when you hear, when you think about the I Have a Dream speech, what does it speak, how does it really speak to that movement then, and how can we use it now?
Okay, that was a revelation also to me that Dr. Hiram Lewis Gates brought out.
Yes.
I think that was during the Albany movement, the Albany, Georgia movement, when the lady proclaimed, I have a dream, and Dr. King adapted that statement.
Prathia Hall.
Yeah, Prathia Hall. She was a minister also, the Reverend Prathia Hall. And the first time I heard that expression by Dr. King was when he spoke in Detroit, Michigan, about 3 or 4 months, I think, before the March on Washington. And he used that phraseology, I have a dream. And I think it was Mahalia Jackson that encouraged him to march Washington while he was speaking at the Lincoln Memorial to tell us about the dream, Martin, tell us about the dream. And that's when he went into the I have a dream run. But I think that a lot of that dream for Dr. King that we perceived back, as Cheyenne was indicating, back in the 50s, we were excited. We were engrossed with the civil rights movement. I mean, we were not afraid. In the song, We Shall Overcome, we were not afraid because we had a sense of destiny then. Sometimes I think that even with our progress, we have regressed.
Yes.
And we've taken things for granted. And we've got to reinstitute that old tradition where the black generation tells its own generation about what has been, what is, and what we hope to see. So I think the dream for a lot of the present generation is a dream deferred, and there's a lot of restlessness within our generation because there's not an appreciation for what the civil rights movement proved to be as far as the progress of our people.
You say that that as we look at this new movement, and I'm referring to the Black Lives Matter, as you say that, it makes me think that the dream, is it different from the civil rights movement to what they're doing at the Black Lives Matter? And I know the birthplace of the civil rights movement, of course, was in the church. How is it different?
I think what we experienced with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the women's rights, voters' rights, all of it, I think represents an extension of the original civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. They've just taken different tenets, different approaches. And of course, we have different personalities who are designated as leaders for these movements, or spokespersons. And I think that that they are certainly relevant for this day and age. I just think that there has to be a kind of total involvement of people as far as the concept of the philosophies of each one of the movements.
I love that you said a total involvement.
Me too. Yeah.
Cheyenne, I would love to get your thoughts on the Black Lives Movement because you were such an integral part of the movement. And one thing you talked about, which really resonated with me, is the courage, right?
Yeah.
And you, at 8 years old, you had that type of courage that would lead you from following your parents to being a part of something that you knew was dangerous. As you see the Black Lives Matter movement, as you see the things that are happening now, what is your perspective and what is your thought on the power of this movement, and is it even related to the civil rights movement in your perspective, from your perspective?
Well, I totally agree with what Reverend Jordan just said. The Black Lives Matter movement, it opened the eyes and raised awareness of the unfairness to Black lives, much like it did in the 60s. And today, I see it, when people start hearing about Black Lives Matter, they looked at the Black Lives Matter movement as a radical movement. But then when we saw the challenges in which we were plagued with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, we saw a different perspective and the real perspective of what Black Lives Movement represented. And for me, it gave me hope. It gave me hope because when I saw young people with the Black Lives Matter who came out and protested in a nonviolent way, who stood up for what they believe in, that they knew that was right. And these were young people of color who had come, who demonstrated this and protested the way that Dr. King would have loved to have seen, the way that under the ministry of Dr. King, under the nonviolent ministry. It really gave me a lot of hope that these young people first had to have courage. Many of them of color, they came out when their parents didn't even know. You know, and when we look at that, and we saw this from a national and a global standpoint, we saw change. But for me right now, what really matters is that not only these young people hold on to that courage, but they got to be consistent in that movement. We got to look for continuity because right now we hadn't had too many deaths that has raised the consciousness for people to go out and protest, but we're still being challenged with the same thing. But we got to keep teaching, we got to keep training, we got to keep on dialoguing, we got to keep young people engaged so that they would understand not only the magnitude of the problem and the mission in which they are fighting for, but they also need to understand how critical it is to stay on the line. To stay on the line.
Good point. Yeah,
stay on the line. Yes. And staying on the line means that you stay in an engaging mode where you're constantly teaching other young people. You're constantly training other young people.
Do you think that's where the church played an integral role in the civil rights versus now? Because we know the church is not the foundation of the Black Lives Matter movement. So do you think that is the reason maybe that there's no consistency when it comes to keep fighting this battle, like we have the highs and we have the lows?
Yeah.
Either way.
I think Dr. King used to always say that the black church has to be the headlight rather than the tail light of a movement, of the movement. And I think what happens today with the Black Lives Matter, Yolanda and Shay, it sort of resonated throughout America as a kind of a threat to the psyche and the mentality of America, just like Black Power, the expression Black Power meant back in the 60s. That frightened the power structure of America. And all people were saying is that we want to be free. We want to be recognized. We want to be accepted as human beings because we have dignity and we have self-respect and we have somebodyness, as Martin Luther King would often say. But the church today seemingly has lagged behind and allowed the secular aspect of society to take the leadership role, whereas I believe the black church is still the epicenter for the black community, even though we live in a more desegregated society. I think the church still has that force and forcefulness that it possesses for our people, and somebody's just waiting for the church to step up again.
I like that. The church step up one more time.
One more time.
But I like it when the church does step up, that we will stay on the line. And I think that, I don't know if there's a true leader in Black Lives Matter. I don't know who's leading the group. Has there been a name, has there been a group or organization of a body of a committee saying we are Black Lives Matter? Because I think when the civil rights movement and they met in churches, there was a default, there were some leaders, some pastors, correct?
Well, I think that's where divine inspiration comes from. I think it's where God steps into history. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just happen. It was preordained by God for him to be sent to Montgomery, Alabama, for him to have that relationship with E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks, and to be assigned to the then Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. and he was elected by the people.
Right.
The 50,000 blacks in Montgomery elected Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader, but God had preordained him to be. So he was perceived as our modern Moses. And we haven't had a singular leader, so to speak, since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So you have a confluence of so many organizations and philosophies now. So everybody's going all kinds of ways.
That's right.
And then that seems like it's not as organized as the civil rights movement was, because they have to have foot soldiers and how we're going to move from, because you didn't wake up one morning and say that we're going to go to Selma.
Right.
Well, that's what I talk about when I previously talked about the continuity.
Yes.
This is what needs to be happening now.
Right.
It needs to be some type of engaging with strategizing and organizing with all of the Black Lives Matter leaders, because like Reverend Jordan said, you have so many different leaders, from different states, different cities. And these are the type of things that we need to really engage with our young people, to get them connected together, to organize, to strategize,
Exactly.
because those were the vehicles that Dr. Martin Luther King actually led through. I mean, and they were very strong. And so that's why we can't just point out one particular Black Lives Matter leader now.
Right.
But because they have to come together. But we really got to be the ambassadors to help them with that,
If there was no Dr. Martin Luther King, do you think you would have still been engaged in the movement like you were?
You know what? I've been asked that question numerous times. I really don't know. In a real sense, because he gravitated my mind and my heart it would have had to been somebody just as strong. So I really don't think so.
Somebody like Pastor Jordan just
Make me feel good.
it's the truth.
But it was just something just so special about this man.
That's what we talk about, once in a lifetime experience.
Yes.
Yes.
To have somebody to come into your life and to your psyche, and just to hold you spellbound, even 40, 50 years after his death. We still talk about Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
And just as a point of reference, we're just seated tonight a few feet away where the South Jackson Street bus that was segregated would roll up and down the streets. And going back into our childhood days, we had the energy and we had the motivation and the excitement of seeing an empty bus ride by and know what that represented. That Black people were standing together, and that we recognized we weren't going to ride that bus until we got the respect that we thought we deserved and the treatment that Black folk in Montgomery deserved at the time. And so that was that kind of fervor in the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus protest, that generated whatever we experience today. But we've lost, as Jesus would say, we've lost our savor for the civil rights movement, seemingly. But we're enjoying the benefits from the root,
But this
fruit.
is the question that I have. It's so amazing how you said how you all got together and it was important for you all to see and know what an empty bus represented. How did you all get that communication? It was through the church?
Through the church. As children, we were excited as adults to go to mass meetings every Monday and Thursday night in Montgomery.
It was in the church.
That's right.
Church to church. And see, as Cheyenne mentioned earlier, hear the singing of the freedom songs, the prayers that were generated by the elders in the church before the mass meeting began, the orations of the preachers, especially Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who would rally the crowd. The churches would be overflowing. Every mass meeting, there was not a monotony. People were just excited week after week after week for 381 days because a movement was taking place in Montgomery, Alabama.
That's
What
right.
was the moment for you? What was the defining moment that you said, I have to be a part of this? We have to make a difference. What was your moment?
I think the moment that was a rude awakening for me was the night that there were about 5 or 6 bombings in Montgomery, bombings of churches and residences of Montgomery. Dr. King's home, I remember the night that our house was about 2 blocks away from where we are now, but 2 blocks away from his home on Grove Street. He was on Jackson Street, just a few steps from the old Benmore Hotel. And I remember going up there with the crowd that night outside of his house, and remember seeing Dr. King come on the front porch to quiet the crowd because people were going to respond in a violent way because of what had happened by way of the bombing of his home. But when he came out and spoke compassion and love and said, everything is all right, my family is okay, my wife is okay, go home, put down your war tools, go home, everything is all right. That was a turning point for me. Here was my pastor, and I saw the glaring lights. The mayor of the city, or the city commissioners at that time. Montgomery was commission form of government. You had a person who was in charge of the police, somebody in charge of the mayor, and you had the health or fire chief, whatever. And so they were on the porch that night along with Dr. King. But people were ready to rise up and revolt because his home had been bombed. He was the leader. He was our Moses. Some of the old sisters in the church called him the Lord.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
In the documentary last night, if you have not watched it, make sure you watch it on PBS. It's pbs.org. It's 2-part series, and in the first part, as a matter of fact, in the first few minutes, Dr. William Barber made a comment, and I want to share. I'm loosely stating his comment because he said it in a weird way, so I want to make sure it was clear. But for Pastor Jordan, he stated this. He said, I think the church is a powerful force against sin when we focus on 3 folds: the prophetic social justice, holiness, and spiritual empowerment and worship. Share your thoughts on that.
Okay, I also saw that, and I think that Dr. Barber is a very prolific speaker himself. In fact, he's been to Montgomery several times and has spoken. The most recent time I remember was the celebration of Montgomery Improvement Association a few years ago at First Baptist Church. But I think the civil rights movement has always been socially prophetic. Dr. King preached a social gospel. That social gospel came from one of the theologians by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch, who ironically was in Rochester, New York. And Dr. King interpreted the Christian religion, the Christian concept, and this ran all the way through the documentary of Dr. Gates last night, night before, that you could not be Christian if you did not believe in Jesus Christ. And if you believed in Jesus Christ, you had to know that he himself was and is revolutionary. He was sent into the world to change, to transform not only the system, but transform the mentality of people.
Right.
So I think that socially prophetic, I think it's a holy movement, that the church represents holiness. That's just not a denomination, but that's also a concept of people who are cleansed in the spirit of Jesus Christ and know the Lord for themselves, and who are able to stand up behind their religious beliefs.
I love that quote, and you're right, he's a really great minister. Cheyenne, I do want to ask you this question. Is the black church still the for the black community?
Wow. Wow, you may should have asked Reverend John back. Yeah, you know, I truly believe that in a great sense the church is. Let me tell you why. There is nothing that we as a people, young or old, can go in dealing with our challenges, personal challenges, and even our societal challenges, that we don't need the church involved, or we don't need to value what the church represents. I don't think we ever need to walk away from that thought, because the church is what gives us hope gives us that value, that sense of worthiness, regardless of what we're being challenged with. If we're not running to the church, we run into the pastor to talk about it. And all of us are faced with challenges today. They may be different challenges from the 60s, but and some of it still is much of the same. So I think the church is going to be very pivotal in our lives, no matter what. We can say what we will or may, but the church is the pivotal point that all of us need to be and stay connected with.
Right.
And in addition to what Cheyenne just said, I noticed, and I was glad that that was brought out in Dr. Gates' presentation on the black church, that with all of the varying denominations, you know, the Church of God in Christ, the United Methodist, the African Methodist Episcopal, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Baptist Church, whatever it was, it's still the black church. And then we come together for a common cause, and that is to free black people from our enslavement, not just physical enslavement, but our own mental enslavement. So the church still has a pivotal role for our community. It's just if our community would respond to the church. We can't just deal with individual congregations being successful. It's a blessing, but we're talking about the holistic situation of the black church in America. And then we got to realize again that there has to be a kind of total involvement of people in the black church to bring about the kind of realizations that we would like to have.
So in that same
vein,
back then, well, throughout the years, the pastors of the ministers were always the leaders, and I thought it was really interesting that some of the first people that were voted into government, they were pastors and leaders.
Right.
So are pastors still the leader of the black community?
I think so. I think that the pastor is seen as an instrument of God to be used to lead our community. Many times I think we have failed as pastors because we have not been true to our own calling. Again, with Dr. Gates' presentation, something as simple as relegating the black woman in the black church. You know, we fighting for freedom from the white oppressed, but yet instead we oppress the black woman in the church. So there has to be a kind of realism within our own church that we have to free ourselves from some of the stigmas that we have within our church.
That's a good point. Cheyenne, we wanted to ask you that same question about our pastors, ministers, still leaders in the community.
I think in a great regard they are, and let me tell you why. In our communities, we have pastors of different religions that's helping to lead us and guide us spiritually. And we all take great pride in respecting our pastors and looking up to them and really having great expectations for them to lead.
That's right.
So it used to be a time, Reverend Jordan, when some time ago, pastors didn't get involved in politics.
Right.
But now you see pastors getting involved in politics because they didn't, you know, people would say they don't want to mix, you know, politics with religion. But I think it's a good thing that when we have our leaders as pastors in the church, why can't they become leaders in our community?
And let me also add, individual personalities like the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who ran for president of the United States, Al Sharpton. Just recently, Dr. Warnock, pastor of Ebenezer Church, where Dr. King served as co-pastor with his father, recently elected senator for Georgia. So there's a kind of momentum, I think, where there's a resurgence of the pastor, the minister, the black minister in the church, trying to take a more leadership role. And then you're walking hand in hand with women in the movement. Look at Stacey Abrams.
That's right.
I believe in equal time for the ladies.
Yes, well, you are surrounded by a whole lot of women.
Yes.
Yes, you gotta say it, Pastor.
No, Cheyenne, I do want to talk about that because he brought up a good topic about the women in church and women in the movement. So, because he took a long time, well, he took a good bit of the second part of the segment, to talk about the women who were integral in the civil rights movement, integral in the church. So I want to talk from your perspective and your experience as being a woman leading in the different facets that you have in the civil rights movement, and even now, what for you has the Black church really accepted the movement of women leading?
I think they are now. I don't think that has always been the case, but I think that women are making their rightful place, not only in the community, all over the world. Women have always been in the background. They've been the backbone of the movement, and now is their time to rise. And it has come to this time and juncture for women to step up and be those leaders. I mean, we have Stacey Abrams, our first African-American vice president. I mean, we can name many women. And it's so rightfully deserved now for women to do what they do, because we can handle it. I mean, we're very, very much.
You wouldn't be a Black woman if you didn't.
That's right. We can handle it.
And we can handle a lot of things.
Yeah.
We're women with a wealth of intelligence and activism. So why not? This is our time. So we got to do it.
Why was it a struggle, Pastor? Why has it been a struggle to see women in those leadership positions in the church and in the communities?
Well, I think it's a reflection of the American concept of men being in charge. I think that's one of the mores of this society, that the male was seen seemingly the leader of the family, of the community, of business, in the church, whatever the case may have been, but it didn't make it right. You know, if we were to be honest, even today, majority of our population in churches is composed of women.
Right.
You know, and we don't complain as pastors. We don't complain when it's time for anniversaries.
That's right.
When the sisters want to take the leadership role,
Making those cakes
right?
and dinners.
Making those
Yes,
cakes and whatever,
decorating.
the pastors' aid committee and all. And but I think it's just important for there to be a kind of equalization within the church community, where we recognize the right of everybody to be worth somebody. So that's important. And personally, in my ministry, I believe in that, and trying to project the concept that the female is just as important as the male within the congregation.
Now,
it's important.
Now, when you say that, I know that you were probably the first Black Baptist pastor to receive a woman in the pulpit. What was that time like for you? Because I'm sure your brothers gave you
Right.
some.
It was a little difficult dealing with women in ministry within the community, but that was a kind of preparation, a prepping of our congregation, to let our congregation know that everybody is important. We cannot question whom God calls to preach. We can't question who God calls to minister. But we have to receive them, for Jesus says, whosoever will, let them come. And so you hear that constant theological argument by many by saying, well, women were always highlighted in the Bible, talking about Mary being the earthly mother of Jesus, the women around the cross, the women who brought the news that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. So those are arguments that women had pivotal roles in the life of Christ.
Right.
So why not in the church of Jesus Christ? And so we're trying to project. Ironically, within the next week, we're hoping to license another female within our congregation.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You know, it
that
wouldn't have
is
been
awesome.
easy 25 or 30 years ago if we had not launched out to try to expose our congregation to this concept of women ministry.
One of the mentions also on the PBS series, Dr. Gates had interviewed, I think it was a female preacher, and so the comment was made that we have so readily been able to speak on a civil rights movement, but also we're also oppressing our people. It's okay to accept us in certain ways, but is it okay to accept all people?
Right.
And so you remember.
I think there was a reference to the minister in Oakland, California. I think it was.
I think so.
Because they started talking about the contemporary music in the black
and that's
the
what
church,
I want to segue into
also,
the different dynamics, because
Right.
you know, if we shout and that was a dance,
Right.
how do you feel? Are we still oppressed in a way that we accept certain things in our churches, or are we beginning to accept more different music or different views?
I think we have to be very careful in our own culture as blacks that we don't allow our brothers and sisters of other hues take our religious experience. You know, the shout used to be unique for the black church.
It's a little dance.
You know, the dance used to be unique. Now you have a cross-generational, cross-cultural kind of experience where you have a lot of white ministers who have adapted the styles of black
Right.
ministers, and just about taking control of what we consider our unique religious experience. So we have to be careful we don't lose that. I think it's important for us to retain our genuineness in our religious experience.
Yeah, because you know, people now, they were like, it doesn't take all that. What are you doing?
Right.
Yeah.
You know, shouting is almost has begun to be unheard of.
Right.
Expressing in a dance format.
Our expression.
Yeah, that's almost beginning to be unheard of in our churches.
Right.
I
it
think
is.
a lot of that comes from because in the documentary it was a very important piece where they talked about the more economically sound the black family became,
Right.
the less they depended on the church,
Right.
and the less and the more they wanted to separate from those traditions.
Right.
So I really do think that plays a lot of it, and I can go into my whole long story, but you guys get to hear me all the time, so we're gonna keep with these wonderful guests. But I do want to ask Cheyenne, what I know you mentioned one song earlier, and I want to talk about music in the movement with you. They did talk about the freedom songs, and I love they had
Yes.
a great bit on there, because I didn't know half of that stuff. I tell you, I
Yeah.
learned a lot. Watch PBS.org, Black Church 1 and 2. But Cheyenne, I want you to share what did the song, not just what song, but how did the song inspire you? Like, what was it that of that song that made you want to get up and go, or did it make you want to get up and go? I just want you to tell me about songs and how impactful it was in your ability to pick up your courage and run.
I think other than prayer, music was a very important piece of the movement, because music was the piece that gave us hope. And many of the songs that came out of the movement, it talked about what was going on and how we had to face what we had to face. Like, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. That meant that everybody who was a part of that movement, we were there, and we weren't gonna let nobody turn us around. But you just couldn't say that now. It wasn't that easy just to say it or to sing it. It had to be something deeply embedded in your heart and in your spirit. Number one, for you even to be a part of it. But like Reverend Jordan said earlier, it was something about that man, Dr. Martin Luther King, that gravitated the hearts and minds of everybody. And I could remember vividly, and this will answer your question. When I used to go to the mass meetings and sit on that front pew, Reverend Jordan, and join in the singing of the songs, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. We shall not be moved." And I would join in the singing and the clapping, and you know, they patted their feet. And sometimes I didn't even know the song, but it didn't take me long to find out. And
You
I
had the
remember,
rhythm and the soul.
oh yes, it was just something. You just had to be there. But let me tell you, I remember vividly sitting on the front pew waiting for Dr. King to come. And Reverend Jordan, we were just singing those songs and praying, and I remember we were singing this song, "We Shall Not Be Moved." And all of a sudden, everybody had begun to stand on their feet and clap their hands louder. And Dr. King and his entourage was making his way to the pulpit. And all of a sudden, that song transitioned into another song. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And everybody was just always happy and excited to see Dr. King anytime that he would come. And of course, when Dr. King came and made his way to the pulpit in Brown Chapel Church on that night, everybody was just singing and clapping their hands. It was just like a shout to God.
Wow.
And Dr. King just stood there, Reverend Jordan, at the pulpit, just glancing over his audience. All of those courageous people who were there. And I remember before he could even sit down, I ran up and sat on his lap. And that became a tradition for me whenever he would come. So the power of music, it was powerful because it embedded within our spirits, within our spirit and our hearts. Those songs meant so much. And they weren't just words that were being sung. They were actually actualized through our actions. Because, again, you had to have courage. And it was easy for people to come up with those songs, Reverend Jordan. Sometimes people would be laying in their church on pallets, sleeping bags, making up freedom songs. What was in their heart. So they just weren't just songs. Those songs were written from the heart, in which people, the things that people felt, and what they saw and experienced during those turbulent times. So they were melodies of hope, and they meant a lot.
One thing I always enjoyed as a pastor was to try to transfer the historical significance of a lot of our songs to our younger generation in the congregation. We're thinking in terms of Black History Month celebration. I wouldn't think of not having Lift Every Voice and Sing being sung Sunday after Sunday during Black History Month, where the congregation can reflect upon our progress, look back on our history, and for young people, hopefully, to have a sense of pride, of self-respect. We Shall Overcome, that's that freedom song. Evokes a kind of emotion where you saw Black folk hand in hand and trusting God together. We will overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe. And then to close out on that Lift Every Voice and Sing, we talk about God of our weary years. Folk who came to those mass meetings, who walked during the Montgomery bus protests, who marched on what, those folk came from varying aspects of life, tired and weary, wounded. And the church evoked this sense of somebodyness to let them know that here was a place that you could always come and you could release that pent-up emotion that you've had, the white overseer, the oppressor. But here you had the freedom to express, your feelings of liberality in the Black church. This was still, is still, with the oppression that we experience as people in America today, the church is still the only thing that we can call our own.
That's right.
That's right.
That's really profound. I didn't hear that at all last night. I love that the church is the only thing that we can really call our own.
That's right.
We don't own the banks. We don't own the higher educational institutions. This is just it. This is it. This is the only place that individuals can be recognized as far as positions go, and personalities, can take leadership roles in the church and so forth. We are in a desegregated society, but we're not free yet. We're not free.
Wow. We're not free yet.
But we shall overcome.
Cheyenne, he said we're not free yet. What do we do now?
We just got to keep our eyes on the prize
Eyes on the prize.
and hold on. But we can't hold on without being engaged.
Powerful
We have
point.
to find a way to stay engaged.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have that listening ear and know what's going on and what we need to do to bring about change. And we constantly have to focus on making sure that we educate our young people and get them engaged.
Because you're still fighting the fight, aren't you?
Of course I am. I always
Good
fight
fight.
the fight until my time is over.
That's
You know,
right.
fighting the fight, you know, you can look at that from different angles. As
That's
long
right.
as I'm here on this earth, I'm going to always stay in a mentoring posture,
Mm-hmm.
particularly dealing with our young people, because there's a lot of room for them to be educated. And we got to be their ambassadors and really pushing them and encouraging, inspiring, and motivating them to do something, to not only make a difference in their lives, but to make a difference in the lives of others. So, you know, there's room for all of us to play our parts. We just have to decide, what are we going to do?
Pastor Jordan, what are we going to do? What's next? What's next? How do we keep pushing towards freedom? How does the black church help us keep moving towards freedom?
Well, I know it sounds trite to say it, but realistically, we've still got to trust God.
That's right.
We got to trust God. And then if God is who he says he is, then we will have the kind of Martin Luther King used to call it the zeitgeist, called it the spirit of the times. We'll have that concept that we have to be involved, that we have to bring about change, that we have to be the catalyst for American society. We can't just depend upon President Biden to be the emancipator for us. We have to emancipate ourselves. And the only way we're going to do this is to free our minds, our psyches, and be able to go about our Father's business.
That's right.
I just see, I like that. Cheyenne, you were called by Dr. King. He gave you this name, the smallest
Freedom
fighter.
Smallest.
And you still have that fight. That is so exciting for me to see that you still have that fight. What are some words that you could encourage our young people about having the fight? It doesn't matter what age, but give us some encouraging words to our young people about having that fight. You know, we have many in this Black Lives Matter movement as well.
Sure. Number one, for young people, I will always say that you must always know that you matter. You matter. You must always know that as long as you're standing up for what you believe in that's right, your voices can be heard. You must try to get the best education that you can. Go as far as you can to get the best education that you can, to gain the knowledge that you need to gain. And then you must stay engaged. You're never too young to do something to make a difference. Never too young to do something to make a difference. But whatever you do, you got to always keep God first in your life. And you got to love you. Because when you love you, then you can love others. And you can exuberate that respect for others, that kindness for others. And always get you someone to mentor you. Be under the umbrella of a good mentor, someone that you can admire and look up to help you along the way, because it's not going to be easy. You're going to have your ups and your downs, just like anybody else, but you got to stay in the fight. And the only way you can stay in the fight is you got to keep God in your life. You got to keep God in your life. You got to keep love in your heart. That's all.
That's it.
I want to mention this real quick. It was a quote, and I think it was probably Hosea Williams probably said this quote, and he said that for young people in order to stay engaged was to vote. Because if he said if you didn't vote, you was just like being a slave.
That's
and
right.
one of the most, I just remember reading, and I was like, yeah, that's being engaged, being a part of Black Lives Matter. Your power also lies in if you have that voting right, that voting power as well. So I thank you. I thank you for sharing your knowledge. It's been certainly a pleasure hearing you just speak about it and just being in you all's presence to know about the civil rights.
Hadn't it been amazing?
Yes, it's
Pastor,
wonderful.
Pastor Jordan, as we
Yes.
get ready to end, I just want you to share some encouraging words to those who feel like, which we really didn't get to talk about, that Black people just adopted Christianity and Christianity isn't for us. So just inspire some, share just a word of encouragement for about 45 seconds, Pastor.
45 seconds. All right. That's just like the Baptist preacher said, I'm closing seven times, and he never closes out. But what I would really try to encourage young people in our community to be about, Martin Luther King used to often say, if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, then be the best street sweeper. If you're going to write books, write books. If you're going to sing, be the best singer. The world will make a beat path to your door. So I think if there's a commitment of sharing your God-given talents and gifts to the world will find a place where you are and meet you where you are. You can be anything that you desire to be if you just know God and trust in Him, and God will make a way for you.
That's right.
Amen.
Amen.
You did it. You did
45
it.
seconds.
Thank you so much,
Wonderful.
Cheyenne Christberg. We want to tell her happy birthday. She celebrated her birthday yesterday.
Yes,
Thank
happy
you so
birthday.
much. She came to share it with Hearts and Hills. Thank you, Pastor Jordan.
Thank you.
These are two of my great mentors, so they get to pour
Yes.
all this wisdom. Don't y'all
Thank
be
you, Pastor
jealous out there.
Jordan.
But listen, we'll be back here next week. We got one more series in the Black Church. We actually have Dietrich Hatton and some other guests that will be on to talk about music in the church. So make sure you tune in next week. Remember, we're here every Thursday at 6 o'clock. We're going to be here same time, same place. It just gets better and better each and every time. And whatever you do, do it with all your heart. And make sure you walk it in your stilettos, ladies. We love you guys, and we'll see you
love
next
you.
week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been so